Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing some important international security questions with our special guest on the Bugajski hot seat, Ian Brzezinski, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, and head of the Brzezinski Group in Washington, D.C. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled Unfreezing the Kosovo-Serbia Dispute. The victory of Vetevendosja in Kosovo's elections has created both confusion and concern for the future of the planned talks with Serbia. However, the new government in Pristina may actually provide much needed realism in the international approach to the frozen dispute. The White House is seeking results in the Pristina-Belgrade dialogue before the 2020 presidential elections. President Donald Trump wants a historic foreign policy success in the Balkans and claimed during the election campaign that he is finally ending America's endless wars. The White House appointed Ambassador Richard Grenell as special envoy for the talks because he is results-oriented and does not get bogged down in process. However, the new envoy will face significant political challenges in achieving a rapid breakthrough. Nonetheless, this may enable him to discover what lies at the core of the dispute: Belgrade's refusal to recognize Kosovo as an independent state. Alexander Vucic's government will seek to discredit the incoming government in Kosovo in Washington's eyes. To deflect attention from the necessity of recognizing Kosovo, Belgrade will claim that the Serbian minority in Kosovo is repressed and needs closer protection by Belgrade. One can only imagine the international outcry if Tirana or Pristina were actively engaged in undermining the integrity of neighboring states on the pretext of defending their kindred communities. The border adjustment question is also a trap for Pristina, whereby territory is supposed to be surrendered without meaningful reciprocity. Belgrade has used the temptation of land swaps to drive wedges between Albanians and Serbs, to divide Albanians themselves, and to depict Kosovo as a failed state without a credible national program. The new Kosovo government needs to devise a dialogue strategy that can gain US confidence by demonstrating seriousness about a final agreement. As a goodwill gesture, this could begin with the lifting of tariffs in Serbia that will test Belgrade's sincerity and place pressure on the Vučić government to reciprocate. If Grenell concludes that the main stumbling block to resolution is the government in Serbia, then he will face one of two decisions. He can either walk away from the dispute and leave it once again to the EU to drag on indefinitely and threaten regional conflict. Conversely, Grenell can apply more sustained pressure on Belgrade to commit to a resolution that will culminate in recognizing Kosovo's statehood without any more prevarications and provocations. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat with Ian Brzezinski, formerly Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and for NATO, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council here in Washington, D.C., and head of the Brzezinski Group in D.C. Welcome to the show, Ian.
Morning,
Glad to have you back. I want to focus today on, I suppose you could call it a political crisis, a political showdown in Washington, the whole impeachment question, and what impact that has on US foreign policy, particularly policy towards NATO, towards Europe and so forth. First of all, starting with the impeachment so our audience understands what's going on, are there sufficient grounds, you think, for an impeachment, or is this more of a political battle, overreach maybe by the Democrats? Does this qualify from what we know under Article 2 of the Constitution? Mm-hmm. What is it? Treason, bribery, high crimes and misdemeanors?
Well, that's the question. So the allegations, Janusz, are that the President of the United States weaponized U.S. national security policies, structures, and resources to cajole, to force another nation to do an investigation into one of Trump's political opponents. The allegations being that investigations are unjustified and therefore wrong and in violation of U.S. law and the code we expect the U.S. president to adhere by. So right now, the House of Representatives, run by the Democrats, are concluding a series of depositions, closed-door depositions, of senior administration officials, a variety of administration officials who were one way directly or indirectly involved in U.S.-Ukraine policy. That'll transition to a more public set of hearings. And probably by the end of this month or in December, probably December being the latest, there will be a vote on impeachment in the House of Representatives. That's likely to be voted and passed, and there will be a trial.
Because the Democrats have a majority.
The Democrats
basically.
have a majority.
Yeah.
The big question will be is what evidence are they able to pull out from these hearings and these depositions? And the question is, will there be a smoking gun? Or will there be a chronology of events and statements and actions that they can put together that makes it indisputable that the president actually committed this crime? So there will be a vote. It's likely to be a party line vote in the House, and it will go to the Senate where there will be a trial. And then the question will be whether or not that evidence weighs sufficiently to indisputably say the president did something that was illegal. And then the Senate will have to judge whether or not that action, that illegal act, justifies a certain punishment. And that could range from censure or to the extreme, which would be the removal from office.
But for any punishment, any consequence, you need a 2/3 majority in the Senate.
That's correct.
Out of 100 senators. Which means that it's very unlikely that he's going to be removed from office because the majority is Republican. Narrow majority, but it's over 50%.
Well, I mean, if you look at just based on straight line numbers, the president has nothing to worry about. But if the evidence proves to be convincing, and if you believe that senators will vote not just along party lines, but also based on their conscience, then the question is open. The knee-jerk reaction is that the president will survive in the Senate.
Right.
People talk about a great red wall in the Senate. But
Yeah.
my sense is that while there is a Senate majority that provides a wall, the president should be careful about how thick that wall is. And I would argue that that wall is fairly thin, because his position in control of the Senate is really through the intimidation of his base. And intimidation is never a strong foundation of commitment.
In other words, that the base would, in primaries, vote out the current senators for a more pro-Trump senator.
The base would turn against those who voted against the president. But if the evidence is clear, unambiguous, I wouldn't assume that Great Red Wall will hold firm.
Well, next few months are going to tell, but what would it take in terms of this, because it all revolves around Ukraine, what would it take? What is the smoking gun in this instance, quite frankly, that would convince a lot of Republicans that have been supporting Trump? I mean, not fanatically, but basically supporting him.
Yeah. I don't want to try speculate on what a smoking gun looks like. I suspect you won't find, assuming the president committed what he's alleged to have committed, a smoking gun would be a tape recording or a directive that clearly comes from the president saying, do X, Y, and Z. A more likely outcome, if in fact this is what's happened, is that there will be a chronology of events and statements and meetings and actions and communications to the Ukrainian government that, when put together, unambiguously, indisputably demonstrates that our national security policies were weaponized by the president for his domestic purposes.
We've already had, for the past 2 years, the Mueller report, and there were certain expectations that would reveal collusion or collaboration, if you like, between the Trump campaign and Russia. It did reveal Russian interference, massive interference in our elections, but it didn't, let's say, find the smoking gun of a quid pro quo between the Trump campaign and Moscow. Is there a possibility that this could be the same?
It could be. I mean, again, the process is basically still in its initial phase. We've heard tidbits from from leaks and statements by participants in the current hearings, depositions that have taken place. And I think yesterday we had the release of the first 2 depositions and more on their way. More and more evidence will become public, and it's still to be determined whether that evidence will be completely conclusive or will it be inconclusive.
Well, let's say if he is acquitted, I'm just sort of trying to figure out what will happen over the next year. Will this strengthen him in the elections? Because we have the elections starting in February. They officially kicking off with the primaries. Would an acquittal of Trump strengthen him vis-a-vis his base and convince a lot of the sort of independents, moderates, that there wasn't much there?
My sense is that if he's able to walk away from this without a censure, without any punishment, it's not going to change the political situation too much. I would argue that Trump has actually been harmed by this whole process. His base may be a little bit more resistant, maybe a little bit more ardent, but I don't think it has expanded. In fact, there's evidence that people have become more questioning of the president's conduct. And you see that in the polls that indicate that nearly half or more believe he should be impeached. That's not removed from office. He should be impeached by the House for the action.
Right. It's a lot, of course, depends on turnout. Do you think this whole process during, not just the impeachment, but everything we've witnessed during this Trump administration, encourages more people to come out to vote? Gives sort of the people feel more responsible somehow, that the vote counts?
It might. I mean, turnout, I don't think it's going to be solely driven by impeachment. It's going to be driven in part by what kind of candidate the Democrats could put forward. And in the last election, they had a candidate that didn't motivate the Democrats' base,
right.
Those who identify with the Democrats. Trump's been very effective in getting his people to the polls. He gets them to show up to his events. Democrats have yet to kind of demonstrate that capacity.
Right.
Maybe one will come in and really challenge Trump in this way.
Exactly. Well, America, we discussed this when we met a couple of weeks ago, how polarized American society has become in the past few years. I mean, you and I remember when you were in Congress how people worked across the aisles. There was consensus. There was a sort of moderate center, both Republican and Democrat. What's happened? Why has it become so polarized? And how will this impeachment probe contribute to that polarization?
I think the polarization is kind of a reflection of our times. I think probably polarization often occurs in times when people feel stress. And so in an age of globalization and rapid, accelerating technological change that generates huge displacements in economies, puts people at risk, makes them uncertain about their future, maybe actually even weakens them, harms them economically. That can be very polarizing as people grab for different extremes to pull themselves out of this morass or this uncertainty. A second big factor, I think, is the technology itself, particularly in social media. Our politics are being transformed by the technologies, techniques, and methodologies of modern social media. And in a way, it's weaponizing the extremes of politics, bringing in nastier dimensions in ways we haven't experienced before. That contributes to polarization.
And if you look at the media, not just the social networks, social media, but if you look at even the mainstream media, people live in different parallel realities, basically, in terms of how they're interpreting events, how they're interpreting politics.
Even journalism, I think, has been hit hard by this. I mean, I fear that the click-based economy now is forcing journalism to focus less on the long-term trends of news and more on capturing headlines and clicks. So they're becoming a little bit less interested in accuracy. They're more interested in speed and being first to report.
And popularity. How many?
And popularity.
Yeah.
And so we've seen some of our own networks become more biased in the way they present news, both on the right and the left. And I'm worried about the loss of that kind of objectivity that used to define American journalism in print and in electronic media, TV media, radio media.
Part of it is how news and opinion gets muddled together, so you don't know which is which, basically. There used to be raw news.
There used to be a real strong code in which journalists would not allow their personal, or they would minimize their personal perspectives on the news, and they would present the facts. Now facts are being presented too often with a heavily personalized, if not political, viewpoint.
Mm-hmm. It's strange, but American political polarization increasingly reminds me of what we've witnessed in Albania, where two parties completely refuse to work with each other. One party has even boycotted political parliament and other institutions, local government and so forth. But there is one area where American parties have traditionally cooperated in, and that's core elements of national security and foreign policy. Do you think that's going to continue despite the impeachment, despite the elections? I mean, there's some important foreign policy questions out there that need to be, there needs to be consensus in Congress to push them.
Well, you know, we started off talking about what the impact of what's going to happen with the impeachment hearings and vote in the House. You know, step back, you could go, what's that impact on American foreign policy? I think that whole issue is going to make us more introspective, more inward-looking, and my fear is perhaps a little bit less responsive, less capable of shaping events internationally as we become solely focused and tied down by the politics of impeachment. And that is a real risk. I fear also that if the president is really threatened by this, his nativist impulses will become more extreme, and he will act on them. And we had an example perhaps of that with his decisions regarding Syria and the withdrawal of U.S. forces from northeast Syria. That is consistent with his nativist impulse. It's something he's wanted to do. It occurred in the middle of this, in a high point or intense point of these impeachment hearings, and he acted. I'd be worried a little bit if I were Ukraine, because Ukraine's got to be very careful about not getting sucked into this morass of polarized politics and impeachment here in Washington. I think that's just a recipe to lose.
It's difficult for them when the president himself is appealing to the Ukrainian president.
Pulling them, and they should, you know, be careful not to get stuck with that tar baby.
Right.
But you know, people may look at America and go, oh my gosh, this is a less reliable country. And the way I look at it, particularly from a transatlantic perspective, is yes, there are a lot of messages that are coming out from Washington that are unhelpful, that are perhaps raise legitimate questions about America's commitment to Europe. But I still think the United States is a good long-term bet for Europe. And that's true of North Central Europe, that's true of the Balkans, that's true of Western Europe. Because when you look at it, the fundamentals of U.S. policy continue to kind of steam forward. U.S. force presence in Europe is increasing. We just put 1,500 troops back in Germany. 1,500 troops back in Germany, the country that Trump keeps on tweeting says he's going to pull troops out. So 1,500 back in there with advanced air defense systems and artillery. We're increasing our force presence in Poland. The United States continues to push NATO to take a more robust response to Russian aggression. And as I said, we're backing up with that with force. You walk over to Capitol Hill, and in the 30 years I've been working these sorts of issues, I've never seen such a level of support for NATO. All you have to do is look at the video.
That was going to be my next question. NATO seems to be a glue that holds, paradoxically, the country together.
Well, it's you know, we're at a time, as I said, unprecedented support for the alliance on Capitol Hill and in the public. Capitol Hill, in real time at the last NATO summit, passed resolutions contravening the language used by the president. And as you know, you just don't do that on Capitol. You have to have leaders aligned, you have to get agreement across parties. It takes time and effort to do that. Yet they were able to do that in real time, both in the House and the Senate, in a bipartisan way.
So paradoxically, is it a reaction to the threat that Trump seemed to pose to the alliance through his words?
Excuse me?
Was it a reaction, paradoxically, a reaction to strengthen NATO, more support for NATO across the aisles in Congress, as a reaction to Trump seemingly threatening to undermine NATO?
I think it's fundamentally rooted in recognition in our political elite, our Congress, many in the executive branch, but also in our public, that this is an alliance that serves our interests. Americans are values-based, and they recognize the alliance not only serves our interests militarily, it serves our interest in promoting freedom and democracy abroad. And they see that and they recognize that. That's why the Chicago Council on Global Affairs just published an interesting set of polls that indicated 78% of Americans believe that U.S. commitment to NATO ought to be sustained or increased. I haven't seen a figure
That's amazing.
that high.
That's even despite the fact that Trump is saying most NATO allies aren't doing enough for the alliance.
Exactly.
And how does that equate? How does that? I mean, presumably there must be some of his voters that support NATO, and yet they don't buy into his argument that NATO isn't doing enough for us.
Well, even with the president often disparaging the alliance, I think it's over 61, 62, 63% in that Chicago Council on Global Policy poll. 61% of Republicans support NATO, think it's important to the United States, despite what the president, the leader of the Republican Party, is saying. So there's a fundamental recognition that this is an alliance that is valuable and important to our interests.
Is Trump, would you say, on the evidence of the last, 3 years, is he an isolationist? I mean, how would you describe his foreign policy?
As a nativist.
Explain that. What do you mean by that?
That means he doesn't want America entangled in foreign wars. He wants to protect American culture in a way he defines it in very, very traditional ways. He sees the world outside as a burden as opposed to an opportunity for the United States. And so a constant theme of his campaign in 2016 and his rhetoric over the last 3 years is to end these endless wars. Bring the boys home, bring the girls home.
Which is the withdrawal from Syria. What's next? Afghanistan. What's
Afghanistan
next?
has always
Korea?
been on his target, and he's indicated Korea also.
And Europe?
In Europe, he's constantly threatening the withdrawal of U.S. forces, particularly from Germany. But it's interesting, you know, as commander-in-chief, his administration has actually seen a reversal of withdrawals. Largely, they were animated and accelerated during the Obama era, when Obama brought the last tank from Europe. They have returned, and the force presence is increasing in Europe and increasing with a real operational edge. I mean, this year we'll reanimate, in 2020, we'll reanimate a mini reforger exercise. Remember reforger from the Cold War? We'd bring 50,000 U.S. troops and equipment to defend the Fulda Gap, to demonstrate our ability to mobilize and deploy to defend our allies during the Cold War. Defender 2020 is going to be a brigade plus of equipment that's going to be deployed for division-level exercises to help defend the alliance's eastern frontiers. And that will be an annual exercise.
Which is quite amazing if you think about it. Does that mean it's not just Congress, there are members of his administration that are pushing for this?
Absolutely.
So there's a contradiction there somehow, or doesn't he notice that this is happening?
Well, I mean, you know, Trump has his rhetoric. I think much of it is designed towards what he believes to be the interests of his political base. But at least until now, until today, he has a cabinet that's fundamentally transatlanticist. You look at Mark Esper, he's a transatlanticist, supported NATO enlargement. Pompeo has always been a transatlanticist. O'Brien, maybe less known, less experienced in
the national security,
realm, but he's not known as someone who is anti-NATO.
I don't know of anybody in the administration that one could call anti-NATO, quite frankly, or even previous holders of various cabinet positions. Was anybody anti-NATO?
Not the cabinet level.
No. So there's another area of bipartisan consensus, despite Trump's rhetoric, and that's Russia. In other words, Russia is recognized as a primary adversary, which is what Mitt Romney was saying during the election campaign. He was correct with Obama.
He was mocked for it.
He was mocked for it because he was ahead of his time. The question is this going to erode, do you think, this during the election campaign? Because what I notice is part of the rhetoric is now turning against Ukraine from the Trump supporters and for, in a way, whitewashes Russian interference in the election campaign. Do you think this is going to change, or something that needs to be closely watched?
Well, what's interesting is that Trump signed the national security strategy of his administration, and not only did he sign it, he took great pride in it. Most people expected him to largely ignore that document, but he read it and apparently was really animated about it, and it was actually and injected himself into its rollout. And that's probably one of the actually sounder, more substantive national security strategies we've had from any administration in the last two decades. And that national security strategy is notable for its emphasis on the reemergence of great power conflicts, with highlighting the challenges posed to the U.S. interests by China and Russia. That's important. it is a national security strategy that has actually fairly bipartisan support. You don't have many Democrats criticizing it as a shallow or misdirected document. People are fundamentally in agreement across party lines that this is the focus we have to have, a focus on the reanimation of great power conflict.
Which is less of a surprise in the Republican side, which has traditionally been, I think, very realistic in that sense vis-a-vis Russian threat. But some on the left, on the Democrat Party, have, I would say, ignored this. You could even say the Obama administration, to some degree, ignored the Russia threat as it was building up. So now you have, in paradoxic fashion, more of a consensus on what Russia is up to vis-a-vis the West.
Well, I mean, it'd be interesting to see what's in the Democratic Party, because there I think they have a spectrum.
Right.
I'm a Republican, but if I look at Biden, of the Democrats, I'm probably most comfortable with I anticipate his posture against Russian revanchism will be.
Right.
You start shifting to the others, Warren, Buttigieg, Sanders, there it becomes a little less clear. Buttigieg may be interesting because he's actually got military experience, and he has recognized the threats posed by Russia and China. But many of the candidates aren't as firm and as strong in their language about the threats and challenges posed by China and, well, not posed by Russia.
Plus, I would imagine the amount of domestic spending that they're promising, this could mean cuts in defense spending.
Budget.
And that's potentially even more dangerous.
At a time when we have to make serious investments to prepare our armed forces for the dangerous realities of high-intensity conflict when it comes to dealing with adversaries like Russia and China.
Russia. Let's turn to Russia now. A couple of things I want to ask. First of all, to what degree is Russia going to intervene in our elections, 2020 elections?
Hard to say, but it should be expected. It's what they did last time. They've gotten smarter at the game, and I see no reason why they would hold back in this election.
I mean, this is a major national security threat to America.
Yes.
Foreign
and
interference in our elections.
It's not just Russia. It can be Iran, it could be China, it could be others.
Or it could be Russia going through third parties, which is a new way.
Same thing, as was reported recently in the news.
So what is it that the Kremlin wants? What is it? Let's go back a little bit. What is it? Why did the Kremlin intervene in our previous elections, the 2016 elections? Was it simply to help Trump, or was that just a bonus when Donald Trump won?
You know, it's hard to say. You know, it's easy to dismiss them as irrelevant. It's easy to exaggerate them, to assume that they were trying to create a Manchurian candidate. I suspect what they were doing was they were experimenting, and the aim of the experiment is to see how much disruption and confusion and discord and paralysis can they inject into the American political system. And they might have succeeded beyond their expectations. Now, that's not to say that they were decisive in the election, but when you look at the kind of the tweets, the Facebook pages they add in, a lot of it is really geared to add to polarization, to create disruption, all of which leads to kind of greater polarization and perhaps political fragmentation and ultimately paralysis.
It doesn't necessarily mean, of course, that they simply supported one candidate, and during these elections they may support rival candidates just to create friction between...
They want to create chaos.
Exactly.
They want to create gridlock. They want to neutralize, paralyze the American political system.
Do you think, I mean, one of the messages I think Russia's trying to inject is, paradoxically, we did not interfere. The more they interfere, the more they claim they're not interfering. But they're trying to turn the tables now on Ukraine. And because of the impeachment probe is focusing so much on what happened between the White House and the Ukrainian presidency, not to mention the general prosecutor and so forth, Russia's trying to turn the tables, trying to whitewash Putin and put the guilt on Ukraine for its own purposes vis-a-vis Ukraine. How will this impact in the US election?
Well, hopefully, in the U.S. election, it depends how it's perceived. And hopefully, I think people will recognize that Ukraine wasn't the driver, didn't interfere, that it was Russia. But clearly, there's an effort by Russia who sees opportunity in this impeachment process to kind of redirect blame that's appropriately directed at Moscow and to place it onto Ukraine. This does two things. It's a double hit. It creates chaos in Washington, and it potentially could alienate Washington from Ukraine, create division create division in what is an important strategic partnership for U.S. interests in the transatlantic area.
And presumably this is a policy that's going to continue throughout the elections. Will it have an impact on voters? I mean, a lot of the Midwest voters, there's a lot of Ukrainians in the Midwest. There are a lot of Central East European people of Central East European descent in those key states that Trump needs, that Trump actually won the election through. Is that going to impact there, do you think?
I think any politician that takes steps that undercuts the security of Central Europe is putting him or herself at risk of losing support from Central European groups, minorities, coalitions in their districts, in their states.
Right.
And so they should be careful of that. And we know the Central Europeans played an important role in the 2016 elections.
Absolutely.
And to Trump's benefit.
Exactly, in those key states. Pennsylvania, which is a huge
Ohio,
Ukrainian population.
Michigan, Wisconsin.
Exactly. And these are voters who traditionally probably are less party inclined. I remember the so-called Reagan Democrats. There was a large number from that region. So they go from one party to the other depending on economic policy, obviously, but also let's say policy towards them other countries.
Well, first they're Americans, so I think they're always going to be interested in how a candidate is going to serve their definition of American interests, material and values based. They're proud of their heritage, and they want to see their, where I'm trying to use the right word, their native lands, so to speak, where their heritage is, to be protected. They want to see those countries benefit from peace, from prosperity, from democracy, and for security. And that does weigh heavily on how they assess candidates.
Right, right. Well, let me ask you, what is it that Russia would want from U.S. policy? Presumably, number one is to lift sanctions. Is that what they're focusing on, will be focusing on?
I mean, I think what Russia would like, Russia's objectives when it comes down to addressing the United States is to neutralize American influence in European affairs, to minimize America's commitment to Europe.
Right.
Essentially, their ultimate desire would be withdrawal of America, an America that becomes really isolationist and less interested and less committed to defending its values, interests, and allies and partners in Europe. That is what Russia would like.
So they must be, from what you were saying earlier, they must be quite disillusioned with the greater emphasis on NATO and the greater investment, greater troop presence, moving of equipment, infrastructure, and so forth. They must be disappointed.
Well, in some ways, the administration and the president has been a mixed bag for President Putin. On the one hand, the president has injected a certain disruptive dynamic within the West, a certain amount of division through trade sanctions and tariffs, through threats of withdrawal. And that is true, and that's probably to Putin's benefit. But Putin cannot ignore the fact that under this administration, his government has faced increased sanctions from this administration, some of them painful. He cannot ignore the fact that the U.S. security commitment to Europe has reanimated. Troops are coming back. And not only are they coming back to their old bases, they're going to new bases in Poland, and they're operating more assertively throughout Central Europe. The U.S. is arming the Ukrainians with lethal military assistance, the javelins, the ships, more intelligence sharing, exercises on Ukrainian territory. That is certainly not to Putin's benefit.
So it's a net loss, I would say, for Putin, given what's happened.
Fundamentally, I think so. I mean, I would argue the United States still needs to do more. The West still needs to do more. But when you look at the security side of the ledger, it has not gone the way Putin desires.
Coming now to some of our NATO allies, there must have been some disquiet in the way Trump was talking, and the revelations through the telephone call, the transcript, and the way he was talking to President Zelensky. Would there be some fear and trepidation amongst NATO allies that we don't want to be put in the same position? I gather there's something brewing between Giuliani and Romania, whether other countries could be involved in this sort of what looks like a quid pro quo.
No country wants to have the United States impose a quid pro quo on them. Mm-hmm. So that transcript didn't enhance U.S. stature in the region, clearly. Mm-hmm. But I would say also you need to look beyond just the transcript of that phone call when assessing U.S. policy and posture in Europe.
Well, let me ask you, to our region, our viewers I'm sure are most interested, what impact of everything that's going on in Washington, the policies that you've outlined, what impact on the Balkans writ large?
You know, the concern I would have for the events going in Washington is distraction and disengagement. Mm-hmm. But with that said, you know, much can happen amidst the chaos
sure.
in Trumpville.
Mm-hmm.
So you have Matt Palmer moving ahead with his efforts. You have Ambassador Grinnell mm-hmm. Engaging on his efforts. Mm-hmm. So you could see there's actually kind of a stepped-up effort by the United States to kind of further the process of reconciliation and development in the region.
So do you think the appointment of 2 special envoys means that we're showing more attention to the region than before, than during the Obama administration?
You know, simply appointing an envoy doesn't necessarily mean you've increased attention. It depends what those envoys do mm-hmm. and the kind of the clout they can bring through their position, you know, the clout they can bring from Washington. And these are 2 new positions, so we'll have to see. But it seems to be moving in the right direction. It seems to be attention is being directed through these appointments. Let's see what they deliver.
And Congress, I mean, we've had several sessions of Senate looking at the region since the appointments. I sense in Senate in particular, but also in the House, there is overwhelming support to try and bring this region into Western institutions, mm-hmm. Including NATO. What is the next step for NATO in the region? Montenegro, already a member. What's the next step with North Macedonia and beyond that?
Well, Macedonia, we had to finish the process of accession. Mm-hmm. You saw the vote in the Senate. It was pretty overwhelming.
Right. I think only 2, the usual 2, didn't. Yeah.
2 opposed. I think it was a vote of 98 and 2
right,
weren't
exactly.
in. You know, the enlargement process needs to continue. I think we can deepen the alliance's ties with Bosnia. Mm-hmm. I think, you know, more attention needs to be given by not only NATO but also the European Union and the U.S. and what can we do to counter some of Russia's malicious actions in the region. Mm-hmm. I think we need to continue to think about how the 3 Cs initiative can be driven forward.
I was going to ask you about this in a second.
Not just within the EU's mm-hmm. The EU members that constitute the 3 Cs initiative,
right.
but start thinking about the vision of the 3 Cs initiative, so it starts extending beyond just EU members and into the rest of Europe, and for that matter also mm-hmm. Eastern Europe, like Ukraine.
Well, actually, and this is a good opportunity, you've been working quite a bit, I know, with Poles and other countries in Central Europe on the 3 Cs initiative. Could you explain to our viewers who may not be aware of exactly what this entails?
The 3 Cs initiative is an effort by the countries of Central Europe between 3 Cs, mm-hmm. the Baltic, the Adriatic.
Seas, not seas. Yeah.
Exactly. Seas as in oceans, 3
right.
bodies of water.
Right.
The Baltic Sea, the Adriatic Sea, and the Black Sea. Mm-hmm. So 12 EU nations in that region want to accelerate the development of Central European cross-border energy, transport, and digital infrastructure. Mm-hmm. These countries still suffer from a legacy of Soviet occupation in that largely the north-south lines of communication are largely absent.
Right.
And the ones that go east-west aren't that developed. Mm-hmm. So developing these cross-border ties will help integrate these economies so they're no longer disaggregated separate economic islands mm-hmm. in Central Europe, mm-hmm. and then help accelerate and finalize the integration of the region, Central Europe, into a wider Europe. And this will be a driver of prosperity and economic growth. It will strengthen economic resilience, including energy security through the mm-hmm. diversification of energy supplies, because you know ports can use pipelines, can help the region tap into global oil and gas markets. It will help complete the vision of a Europe that is undivided, mm-hmm. secure, and prosperous and free. And that is an American interest, because a vibrant, strong Central Europe means a wider, stronger Europe, and such a Europe is a better partner for the United States in dealing with the challenges in the region and beyond.
Are there any Balkan countries involved at this point? Obviously Croatia with the Adriatic. Bulgaria, I presume?
Bulgaria and Romania are members of it. It's all EU countries.
Can it be expanded to Western Balkans, to Central Balkan region?
Well, that's kind of a constant discussion within the 3 Cs. This is a Central European initiative. It is led by the Central Europeans, and these 12 nations have decided to right now keep the membership of the 3 Cs in that EU realm, so to speak. It's my personal view that there's some advantages to that, but they need to start thinking about how the 3 Cs vision extends beyond. And I'd argue to the Western Balkans, but also to Moldova and Ukraine.
Right, and presumably if you're linking the Adriatic with the Black Sea, you have to go through the Western Balkans.
Right, and if you're going to complete Europe, it's going to have to include the Western Balkans and Eastern Europe.
Precisely, and all the way down to Greece, I would think. I mean, Greece is an EU member, NATO member.
That's an interesting discussion, because there is a debate, should other countries be brought in, such as Germany or the United States. And both Germany and the United States have participated in 3 C summits. Some would argue they should be brought in because they're part of Europe, and that's where the infrastructure is going to connect, and it makes sense. Others would argue, such as myself, that, wait a minute, this is a Central European initiative. After 3 decades following the fall of the Berlin Wall, these countries ought to be able to stand up and lead their own initiative. If you brought in a big power like the United States or Germany, it would no longer be led by Central Europe. But there's no reason why, as an observer or a partner, Germany and the United States can't support this initiative. I'm all for the Central Europeans driving it on their own, and making something of interest and worthy of support from countries outside.
What financial commitments have we had so far? Because again, this is a government and business sort of joint venture. The entire initiative is designed as such. What financial commitments have there been so far?
Well, this is interesting you ask, because for the last several years, it's largely been a rhetorical exercise. Now they're beginning to get the edge of going operational, getting tangible. So they are standing up a 3 Cs initiative investment fund. And the Poles have committed 500 million euros. The Romanians have committed 100 million euros. And others are expected to add to that. And they're hoping to get into that fund contributions from the international financial organizations. And this fund will operate on purely commercial terms. It will invest in infrastructure in the region, but without political guidance. The money will come from the governments, but commercial managers will handle this fund, and they will pick the projects that are most profitable. That is a real demonstration of self-confidence in their own region. For these countries to do that.
And I gather some of the Baltic states have also jumped in. Estonia, I think, has jumped in.
Estonia, yeah, the Baltic states have been members of the 3 Cs from the beginning, and this, in 2020, probably in June, Tallinn will host the next 3 C Summit and Business Forum.
Estonia being a good spot for
Estonia's great.
Business, non-corruption and clean
dynamic
hands.
Nation. They get things done.
Digitalized and so
Digital
forth.
ninjas. They have a rule of law brand. They will be great hosts of the 3 C Summit and Business Forum.
Which West Balkan countries do you envisage being next involved? I mean, you've already got Croatia, but Croatia's both EU and NATO member. Do you envisage Montenegro, maybe Albania?
I, as an observer, watching the evolution of 3 Cs and seeing their kind of steadfast commitment to keeping this to EU countries, I suspect that countries in the Western Balkans that become formally members of the 3 Cs will be those that are next in line to join the EU. So my hopes were that Macedonia and Albania were going to be on that list, and I was deeply disappointed and troubled to see the French and others block the accession process to the EU for those 2 countries. They deserve it. This was a wrong... And
it sends a wrong message even to those that are within the accession process, such as Serbia and Montenegro.
It's disillusioning for the whole region.
So the 3 Cs, it's not an alternative, but at least it gives some concrete activity, concrete project for the future.
Yeah, I like to say that it's as important as EU and NATO membership. EU membership brought the political cohesion, the regulatory consistency. It's the open the open doors, the removal of trade barriers, that's critical to economic growth. NATO brought security, that's essential for prosperity, that's essential for freedom.
Right.
But the hardware of integration are those roads, are those highways,
Absolutely.
railroads, pipelines.
And don't forget airports and air connectivity.
That too could be possibly included into it. But that infrastructure is the hardware of integration, and therefore I think as important, 3Cs can be as important as NATO and EU membership.
Well, certainly like to have you back at some point as this initiative develops, because I know you sort of sit in the middle of it. You know what's going on both sides of, on all sides, let's say, in Central Europe. Let me get back to a couple of other questions while we have a little bit of time. We haven't talked much about China. How do you see the Chinese role in Europe? Is this a manifestation of competition with the United States? Is this mostly economically led? Is there a political agenda? How would you describe the Chinese role?
Well, China has been identified as a major competitor by this administration. It's right. It's now ahead of Russia when it comes down to what is our most urgent and significant challenge. It's very interesting how someone like Mark Esper, our Secretary of Defense, makes it very clear. When it comes down to great power competition, our focus is first on China and then Russia. It shows how the global, how the balance of power in the world has changed, not to Russia's advantage. In the case of transatlantic relations, China is now recognized as across the Atlantic, on both sides of the Atlantic, as a challenge of growing concern. The EU has identified China as a significant competitor. The EU has become attuned to the threat posed by China's malign economic behavior, the downsides of the Belt and Road initiative, and Central Europe actually has become a kind of a focus of malign Chinese investment. It's one of the reasons why 3Cs, for example, is urgent. So China has now all of a sudden emerged as a transatlantic priority. And that will get more and more teeth, I think, as time goes on, as both the EU and NATO figure out how they want to address this relationship. And hopefully they will think not just in terms of deterring malign, and if not military activity, but also what can they do together, leveraging the power of the Western community of democracies, its economic and military and political leverage, to shape the relationship with China in a constructive way so that relationship can be collaborative and cooperative.
In the Balkan region in particular, and along this Belt and One Belt, One Road Chinese linkage between China and Europe, one of their policies is to indebt countries along route. In other words, countries that are desperately in need of investment, such as Greece, potentially Albania, Montenegro, Serbia, borrow heavily, but they don't necessarily read the fine print. Could you explain how that works?
Basically, China will come in and provide overly generous terms for projects. Countries accept those terms, projects don't go as well as they want, and all of a sudden they're stuck with a huge debt to the Chinese. The Chinese then translate into either further strategic economic acquisitions and also political pressure.
Right. Right, and presumably there is a diplomatic component as well. Countries that soak in a lot of Chinese investment tend not to vote against China in international organizations.
We're living it today here in the United States. We have the NBA. All of a sudden succumb to
Could
Chinese
you explain
pressure.
that? We have a lot of basketball fans in Kosovo.
Well, you're not talking to a basketball fan, but basically what happened is a manager of the Houston Rockets tweeted out support for the protesters in Hong Kong. And the Chinese immediately slammed back publicly, saying if that statement isn't rescinded, they'll never let the NBA play or never let the NBA have TV access and TV privileges in China, which is a huge market. So the NBA balked and for a few days, but ultimately the NBA came around and said we're not going to censor or monitor or restrict our individuals, our managers and players from expressing their own views, while the NBA will stay neutral. But the fact that the NBA is staying neutral on something as important as values and freedom is troubling. And it shows the pernicious and powerful influence that China has on the global marketplace.
Yeah, and China's a growing economy. As you mentioned, Russia's a declining economy. In a way, Russia disguises its decline through these foreign adventures, whereas China has some meat and muscle behind it.
Russia tends to go for the flash, where China tends to take a very long view, it positions itself, and it feels it has time on its side, and so therefore is patiently and steadily enhancing its strategic posture militarily, economically, and one could even argue ideologically, as you're trying to present a new vision of how the world how it ought to operate, in contrast to liberal democracy, and that is troubling.
Right. One other country I want to discuss a little bit is Turkey, which NATO ally, very strong NATO ally, has invested a lot in the alliance, quite frankly, in terms of its defense spending. It's strategically key, but troublingly has developed a close relationship with Russia. Poor relations now with the United States. Fears that it's trying to have some negative influences in the Balkans, trying to, in a way, let's say, bring these countries away from the EU path. How do you see Turkey's role in the region and in transatlantic relations?
Well, Turkey's role has been mixed. I mean, as a NATO ally, it actually continues to play a non-disruptive, maybe even useful role within the alliance. They're important to the alliance.
Absolutely.
It's a big nation. It's got a big military. And we shouldn't forget that they were on the front line during the Cold War and actually willingly allowed themselves to become a nuclear target when the United States started housing our nuclear weapons there. We should also remember that from a Turkish perspective, relations with the West hasn't necessarily always been positive for them. I mean, the United States invasion of Iraq didn't necessarily benefit Turkey. U.S. stimulating the insurrection in Syria, catalyzing it, supporting it, without robustly going in and backing up those who are trying to put Assad down, resulted in, 2.4 million refugees and all the security threats that come with that on Turkish soil. The EU has basically given the Heisman to Turkish aspirations to join the EU on almost racist terms.
The stiff hand, in other words.
The stiff hand, a big shove away. And this is when Erdogan was in the early phase of his administration, actually pushing constructive, progressive reforms. So we
plus our support of the Kurds, which Turks see as a threat to their territorial integrity.
Which I don't think we've necessarily handled very well with the Turks. I'm sympathetic to the Kurds, but I think the Turks do have legitimate grievances against certain elements of the Kurdish community, the PKK, for example.
Which have been supported by Russia. Of course,
so I am concerned about where Turkey's going, because there are dynamics that are pushing it away. My sense is that we can work this relationship constructively, because it is to Turkey's interest to have a strong relationship with Europe proper, so to speak, with the United States in light of the neighborhood that it's in. Syria is never, Assad is not going to be a great partner. Iran is not going to be a great partner. Russia is a destabilizing actor in its own neck of the woods. Turkey has an interest in close relationship with the West, and my hope is that we'll be able to work our way through these problems.
Ian, very last question, and I want to reflect a little bit back on American politics. Will the two-party system survive in America? I know this is a perennial question, but I think more so than ever before I see, and I've been in the country for over 30 years, I see not just polarization, but radicalization in both parties. The extremes, or we used to be the fringes, seem to be taken over. In fact, the moderate, the centrist ground, those that build consensus, seems to be discredited increasingly. Do you think it will survive the two-party system, or is this an opportunity for some third party to emerge?
Well, clearly there's opportunity for a third or a fourth party to emerge. My gut tells me that the two-party system will sustain, but I also think it's too early to make decisive predictions on what will happen. I think this election will be very, very important, this upcoming 2020 election. Because if Trump wins, he could fundamentally reshape the party in a way that actually divides it. And I think the further that will add to further polarization in our society, in our politics, and with that will also increase friction within the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
So probably if there's a risk of a party breaking up right now, the Republicans are at greater risk. But the Democrats are also feeling those sort of pressures. And a fragmentation in one, I think, will contribute to fragmentation in the other. But I would argue it's too early to say. What I think is safe to say is that the elections and the outcome of 2020 will have a profound effect on both parties.
On that note, and we'll definitely have you back before the elections, because there's a lot of, let's say, water that's going to flow under the bridge over the next year.
It's an exciting time.
Exactly.
And a lot is at stake.
Good time to be in Washington if you like politics, I suppose. Ian, thanks very much.
Janos,
thanks for joining me on the show. And we'll break now for a few ads. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at RTK. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miro Pavshim.